All right, so you're ready to really dig into moral reasoning, huh? And one a philosopher's perspective on it.
Well, you've come to the right place.
That's what we're here for. And we've got just the source for you.
Buckle up.
The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on moral reasoning.
Perfect.
Have you ever like sat there and thought, how do I actually make moral decisions?
Right.
Like what is even happening in my brain?
It's a great starting point because it's not simply like knowing what's right and what's wrong,
Right.
and having that gut feeling. It's really the thinking process that you go through to figure out what you should do given what you believe.
So you're saying it's not just having a moral compass, it's knowing how to use it
Exactly.
and how to navigate with it.
That's a great analogy, especially when things get a little tricky.
Yeah, like what about when you get two different signals or something?
Well, and on that note, there's some really interesting research
How-
in empirical ethics suggesting that even with the best intentions,
Yeah.
we don't always reason in the best way possible. Oh, really?
We fall prey to all sorts of inconsistencies and biases, and even something called moral dumbfounding.
Moral dumbfounding, what is that?
It's basically when you can't provide reasons
Oh.
for your moral intuition.
So you know something feels wrong, but you don't know why.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the brain's on autopilot,
Right.
and we're just reacting.
Huh, interesting. Okay, so what role do feelings play in moral reasoning?
Oh, a huge role, actually.
Really? Because I was thinking like, oh, feelings, that's not very philosophical.
You might seem that way, but emotions and perceptions are actually very much intertwined with moral reasoning.
Okay.
Because before you can even reason about an issue,
Right.
you need to recognize that it's a moral issue at all.
I see.
And that recognition is what philosophers call moral uptake.
Moral uptake.
Exactly.
So you're saying like we need to train ourselves to see the world through a moral lens to pick up on things we might miss otherwise.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
Yep.
And that training involves cultivating our emotions as well. Interesting. Okay, so I'm thinking like empathy
Exactly.
or maybe guilt.
Exactly, those kinds of things. And this leads to a big debate
Okay.
in moral philosophy about what is the role of emotions
Right.
in relation to reason.
Okay.
Are they helping us see moral truths,
Right.
or are they clouding our judgment?
Okay, so it's like a philosophical puzzle then.
It is.
Is there anything like any tools that philosophers have come up with to help us reason morally?
There are, and that brings us to moral principles.
Moral principles.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm suddenly back in ethics class.
Ah, yes.
But yeah, I always thought like, aren't those just rules? And don't rules always have exceptions?
Sure.
Like, can't you just decide what feels right in each situation?
So that gets to a view called moral particularism that
Right.
says there's no need for general principles.
Right.
And that every situation is unique and you judge it on its own merits.
So no universal rules then, just gut feelings.
Well, it's more nuanced than that because
Fair.
even if we don't spell out our principles, we might be applying them subconsciously.
Like rules of thumb almost.
Exactly, like honesty.
Okay.
You know, we might say generally lying is wrong,
Yeah.
but then you encounter a situation where telling the truth could have really bad consequences.
Right. Or maybe like if someone got a really bad haircut and they ask you, what do you think?
Well, maybe. But think about like protecting someone from danger.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's much more serious.
So in those cases, we might lie to prevent harm.
So honesty then is more of a guideline than a hard and fast rule.
Exactly. And moral reasoning is about figuring out
Okay.
how to apply those guidelines in complex situations.
Okay. But how do we choose which principles to apply in any given situation?
So that gets to the heart of it. Moral reasoning is really about figuring out
Okay.
which considerations are more important.
So it's not just blindly following rules, but figuring out which rules matter most.
Exactly. It's like a moral balancing act.
Oh,
And one of the tools we use for that
okay.
is reasoning by analogy.
Reasoning by analogy.
Okay. Comparing the current situation to other situations that we've experienced or heard about
Interesting.
to guide our judgment.
So we look for similarities or differences.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's like moral storytelling in a way.
Yeah, and there's a more systematic version of this called casuistry,
Just
where you compare the situation to these kind of paradigm cases,
okay.
where the moral judgment is very clear-cut.
So it's like building a case file using precedents.
That's a great analogy because moral reasoning isn't always about finding the single right answer,
Right.
but about finding the best fit
Okay.
with all the things that you believe.
So this is all pretty complex. I mean, how do we even know if we're doing it right?
Well, that question has kept philosophers up at night for centuries.
Right, I bet.
And it leads us to the next level of our deep dive, which is the connection between moral reasoning
Yeah.
and moral psychology.
Moral psychology. Okay, now we're going deep.
We are.
What is the connection there?
Well, it's one thing to reason our way to a decision, but it's another thing to actually make ourselves do it.
Right. Or like, what if I get lazy?
Yeah. What if your desires pull you in another direction?
It's like when you know you should eat healthy, but then the piece of cake is right there.
Exactly. So moral psychology helps us to understand the relationship between our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions.
So not just having the moral compass, but having the willpower to follow it.
Perfect analogy.
Okay, so how do we actually bridge that gap then between, knowing what's right and actually doing it, especially when it's hard?
Right. Well, a very influential view, going back to the philosopher David Hume,
Okay.
is that motivation ultimately stems from desires.
Okay.
We do things because we want to,
Okay.
whether it's for pleasure or self-preservation or some other kind of desire.
Okay. So what if we don't desire to do the right thing? Then are we doomed?
Well, Hume also talked about what he called calm passions
Calm passions.
that are involved in moral reasoning.
Okay.
And these are things like empathy or a sense of fairness
Right.
or even a desire for approval from others.
So things that can kind of override those more base desires.
Right, and that can motivate us to do the right thing even when it goes against our immediate self-interest.
Okay, but what if doing the right thing demands some serious sacrifice?
Right.
Like what if it clashes with our deepest desires? Then what?
Yeah, you're getting at something really important here.
Okay.
It seems that some of our motivations are based on principles or ideals
Okay.
that we come to value.
So you're saying we can actually desire to be moral.
Exactly.
Wow.
The philosopher John Rawls called these principle-dependent desires.
Principle-dependent desires.
Okay, so it's not just about the consequences, but about seeing morality as inherently valuable.
So it's like acting according to your values even when it's tough.
You got it.
Okay, so then what happens when two really important principles collide?
Ah, that brings us to prima facie duties.
Prima facie duties, okay?
Which simply means, at first glance,
Okay.
these are duties that we have reason to fulfill, unless they're overridden by a stronger duty in a particular situation.
So it's like a moral hierarchy.
You could think of it that way.
Okay.
Like, think about the conflict between keeping a promise and preventing harm.
Okay, so like if I promise to meet a friend, but then I see someone who needs help.
Exactly. In that case, the duty to prevent harm would probably override the promise.
Okay, I see. So then how do we decide which duty wins?
Well, unfortunately, there's no simple formula.
Oh, okay.
It involves weighing different considerations.
So it really comes down to judgment.
It does, but our judgments aren't arbitrary.
Okay.
They're informed by our perceptions and principles and the circumstances.
So like a trained intuition, you could say.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So can we learn to reason better morally then?
That's a great question. And it brings us to the final point we'll discuss in this first part of the deep dive,
Okay.
which is the idea of moral learning and revising our moral views.
Oh, this is a good one. How do we learn morally?
Well, it's probably a bit like learning a language or a skill. Like, imagine you're learning a sport or a musical instrument.
Right.
It takes practice and feedback.
And failing.
Exactly. And moral learning can involve similar processes.
Interesting.
So we might encounter situations that challenge our beliefs,
Right.
or we might realize we could have handled something differently.
I see.
So moral learning is this ongoing process.
It's not about sticking to those same old rules then.
Exactly. It's about being open to new perspectives
Right.
and refining our understanding.
So our moral compass is always evolving.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, I like that. And this brings us to the end of part 1 of our deep dive into moral reasoning.
Exactly. We've explored a lot of ground, from moral perceptions to the complexities of moral conflicts.
We'll pick right back up with part 2.
Can't wait.
Until then, happy moral reasoning, everyone.
Indeed. Welcome back to our deep dive into moral reasoning.
Last time we were talking about how our moral views can, change over time, but what happens when we have to reason morally, not just by ourselves, but with other people?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because moral reasoning is rarely a solo thing, you know?
Right.
We live in communities and our choices affect other people, so it's like, how do we navigate those shared moral spaces?
Right. And I feel like that's just a recipe for disagreement. Like, how can you possibly reason together when everyone has their own perspective?
It's a challenge for sure, but before we get to that, the complexities of reasoning as a group,
Okay.
let's think about a simpler scenario. What if the decision's being made not by a group of individuals, but by a company or an organization?
Okay, so like something that can make decisions, but how can a company reason morally? It's not like it has a conscience or something.
Right, but philosophers have explored this idea of group agents,
Group agents, okay.
which are collectives that are structured in such a way that they can act and make decisions.
Including moral decisions.
Exactly. Now, for a group to count as an agent,
Okay.
capable of reasoning, it has to be able to form beliefs about the way things are,
Right.
but also beliefs about those beliefs.
Beliefs about beliefs. That's kind of meta.
It is a bit meta, but think about it. To reason, you need to reflect on your own beliefs.
Okay.
See if they hold up and maybe change them based on new information.
Right.
If a group can do that collectively,
Okay.
then we might say it's a reasoning agent.
Okay. I can see that.
Right.
But even if a group can reason like that, in theory, doesn't that open a whole new can of worms? What about bias? Or, some people having more power than others?
You're bringing up some really important considerations, and that's where things get tricky. Philosophers like Christian List and Philip Pettit
Okay.
have argued that even in groups that are trying to be rational and impartial,
Right.
individuals might have incentives to misrepresent their true beliefs.
Ooh, why would they do that?
Well, imagine there's a really strong disagreement in the group,
Okay.
especially about something that's tied to values.
Right.
So individuals might feel pressure to conform or avoid being seen as dissenting.
Oh, I see. So they don't want to rock the boat.
Exactly, and they might even downplay their own views just to reach a particular outcome.
So even when everyone's trying to do the right thing, groupthink can get in the way.
Unfortunately, yeah, and it's especially a problem when we're talking about moral issues,
Right.
where, people's values are really closely tied to their identity.
Right. Okay, so reasoning as a group can be pretty difficult. But what if it's just like a few people trying to work through a moral problem together? Is there any hope of finding common ground, or are we just doomed to argue forever?
Well, it can be challenging, especially when people have really different values.
Yeah.
But even then, open and honest dialogue can be valuable.
But how if they're just talking past each other? What good does that do?
Well, even if it doesn't lead to total agreement, it can help us understand different perspectives.
Oh, okay.
Maybe clarify our own thinking.
Right.
And even revise our views based on new insights.
So it's not about winning the argument, it's about broadening our horizons.
I-
Okay, I can see that.
Hmm.
But let's be real. Sometimes moral disagreements are just impossible to resolve. People just dig in their heels and the conversation goes nowhere. What then?
You're right. That definitely happens. And in those situations, it might be necessary to agree to disagree.
Yeah.
Find ways to coexist peacefully while respecting our differences.
So moral tolerance then,
Exactly.
accepting that there might not be a single right answer.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about individual moral reasoning and now how those perspectives interact with other people. But can we zoom out even more? Like, is there a way to think about moral reasoning on a global scale?
That's an interesting question, and it brings up this idea of a global moral community. Can
Sure.
we think of humanity as a team working together?
A good little team.
Yeah, to solve these ethical challenges and create a more just world.
That's a beautiful idea, but is it realistic with all the division in the world right now?
It's definitely a challenge, but some philosophers believe that despite our differences, there are certain moral principles that are universally shared or at least aspired to.
So you're saying there's hope for some kind of global moral consensus?
It's complex, and there are different views on how it might work.
Okay.
Some philosophers, like Jürgen Habermas, think that open dialogue is crucial.
Okay.
They argue that through reasoned discourse,
Yeah.
we can find common ground, resolve conflicts, and come up with moral norms that are valid for everyone.
So like a global town hall meeting.
You could think of it that way, but it is a bit idealistic, right? The world's messy people have different values and priorities and experiences. Can we really expect everyone to agree on what's right and wrong?
Yeah. I mean, good luck with that.
Right. Some philosophers are skeptical about reaching a full moral consensus.
Okay.
But even if we don't get there, there's still value in striving for greater understanding and cooperation.
Right. So even if we can't agree on the answer, we can at least understand each other's perspectives.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of moral reasoning, not just as a solo thing,
Right.
but as something we do together.
Oh, I like that together.
When we're willing to listen to others and challenge our own assumptions.
Okay.
That's how we create the potential for moral progress.
I'm feeling inspired. Now it's like we're all part of this huge moral experiment, figuring things out as we go.
Yeah, and that highlights something really important about moral reasoning.
What's that?
It's a process. It's a journey we're all on together.
Okay, so we've journeyed through the ins and outs of personal moral choices and zoomed out to that big picture of a global moral community. It's been quite the deep dive.
Yes, it has been a really fascinating exploration.
From those individual moral perceptions we all have
Hmm.
to navigating moral disagreements with others.
We've really gotten to the heart of what moral reasoning is all about, how we handle those tough moral dilemmas, how our feelings and motivations get all tangled up in the process.
Yeah, and how we can learn and grow ethically throughout our lives.
Right. And we even tackled that tricky question of how we reason morally together, how our choices impact others, and how we can find some common ground despite our differences.
It's been a wild ride, but before we wrap up, I have one last question for you. We've talked about moral reasoning as this ongoing process, something we can develop and refine over time.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, is there an end goal? Is there like a destination, a point where we've achieved perfect moral reasoning?
That is a great question, and one that philosophers have grappled with for ages. Some might say that perfect moral reasoning is like an ideal, something we aim for but never truly reach.
Kind of like a moral enlightenment then.
Exactly, a state of perfect ethical clarity and wisdom, but others might say that the very idea of perfect moral reasoning is flawed.
Really, how so?
Well, they might point out that morality is messy, it's complex, it depends on the situation you're in. There are always going to be multiple perspectives to consider.
Right, and even the best thought out decisions can have unforeseen consequences.
Precisely. So it's not about finding that one right answer. It's more about engaging in the process of moral reasoning itself with humility and a willingness to learn and change along the way.
So being open to revising our views as we encounter new information.
Exactly. And that emphasis on the process rather than a fixed endpoint is really important to many contemporary philosophers.
Interesting.
They see moral reasoning as this ongoing conversation, a collaborative effort to make sense of the world and our place in it.
It's like we're all figuring it out together.
Exactly. And that brings us back to something we've touched on a lot in this deep dive, the importance of humility in moral reasoning.
Humility.
Yeah, recognizing that we don't have all the answers, that we're going to make mistakes.
Yeah. And that it's okay to change our minds.
Right. And that openness to change is key for both individual and collective moral progress.
I love that idea that we're all on this journey together and that it's never truly over.
I think that's a really beautiful way to look at it.
This has been a truly incredible deep dive. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of moral reasoning, and it's left me feeling really hopeful.
Me too. It's been a pleasure exploring this with you.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into moral reasoning. We encourage you to keep those conversations going. Pay attention to how you approach those ethical dilemmas, big and small. And remember to be curious, be compassionate, and most importantly, be open to changing your mind, because the journey of moral reasoning is a lifelong adventure. And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating topic.